Hey guys, this is Milo back with another YouTube video, and today I'm going to show you how to make an axe sheath out of leather. This is a beginner guide, so I basically show how to do everything except for how to saddle stitch. And since I've been making axe sheaths for over a year, I have a lot of experience from trial and error, so this is so you guys don't make the same mistakes as me. So let's get straight into the video. So the first thing that you need to do is create a pattern on paper, and then you transfer this to the leather. This basically makes it so you get your whole design out of the way, so you don't waste any leather because it's a really precious and important resource. What I like to do is take a piece of printer paper and fold it in half, and then I line up the top of the axe with that line, and then I trace out the axe, and then I flip it over that line again and trace it out. If you want the axe sheath to close from the top, then you just trace out the beard onto that center line. And one thing that I show in this video is tracing out both sides, but if you fold the paper in half and trace one side, then it's going to be mirrored and symmetrical, so you only really have to do half of this, but I'm kind of just showing the extra work. And one thing when stitching the front of an axe sheath is you need a welt, and that's a third piece of leather that goes in between the two sandwiched body pieces, and that protects the axe from cutting the stitching line. And I make the welt 1/2 inch long, and that's just so that I can add enough allowance for my stitching and then have a little bit of bulk behind that, so that it would take literally forever for the axe to cut through the stitching. And if you're worried about the axe cutting the stitching, like if somebody drops it, then you can put rivets in the welt, like in the center of the stitching and on the top and the bottom, but that's really not necessary, and I feel like that adds kind of a bulky look that I'm not a huge fan of, but it's really up to whatever you want to do. As you can see, to trace out the welt, all I do is I line up my bit onto different dots that I make that are 1/2 inch over the front, and then I just use the axe to connect all those dots, and it works perfectly well. It helps you keep the arc without having to do any guesswork. And one thing that I do a lot throughout the process of making an axe sheath is I just kind of dry fit it and make sure everything lines up perfectly. Because if you're too tight, then it literally will not go on. And if it's too loose, then it's floppy and it's not really a premium, nice feel. And now it's time to cut out the pattern, but I did add a little line on the back of the sheath, and that's just how far back the leather goes. Also, I made a failed attempt where I drew my center line over the bit, and you just don't do that. I'm not really sure why I made that mistake, but it's good to learn from your mistakes because then you can make something better next time. And I'm cutting it out. One thing that I do is I put my ruler up against the paper, and then I make sure to use a low angle when cutting. This helps keep all the lines perfect and straight because you can kind of guide it with the back of the blade by looking over the knife. And then when you're cutting straight pieces, you want to use a ruler that has a cork or a non-slip backing because leather and paper can be really slippery, and I used to just put my body weight onto the ruler so it wouldn't slip, but there's definitely mistakes that can happen with that, and I wouldn't recommend it. And right now I'm cutting off the little trim pieces that don't line up perfectly when I fold over the top of the sheath. This whole process is kind of a byproduct of tracing out both sides of the axe, so if you just traced out one side over a folded piece of paper, then we wouldn't have to really do this work. So it's really up to you and your experience to figure out how you want to do this, because of course as you start leatherwork, you'll gain your own experiences and your own process, and you'll kind of stray away from what other people do. So now it is time to trace the template onto the leather. There's still a few adjustments that I need to add. I need to add trim allowance on one side and then a flap on the other. But for the most part, I'm ready, and I know that if I make this, I'm not going to waste any leather. So that's pretty much what you want to do. You want to be as content as possible. And to trace out the pattern, I have tried a charcoal pencil, I've tried a pencil, but neither of those really show up as well as a pen. The only problem with a pen is that if you make a mismark and you aren't dyeing your leather dark, then that pen mark will show. So you just want to be a little bit careful with that. And there are other specialized pens that will disappear with UV light. So there's really plenty of options to choose from. And I'm tracing out the flap now. I want it to curve from the front as far back as possible. Since the beard is angled so steep, that's going to kind of kick it forward, so I want to counteract that. Also, I fold it over to see how much more I need to trim it, and I trim a lot more later in this process. But right now I'm adding a bit of trim allowance to the side. This is because leather is thicker than your paper, and you're basically transferring something two-dimensional to three-dimensional, so you need to account for the width of the axe, like the profile, and then also the width of the leather, of course. So I actually added too little trim allowance, so I'd recommend like at least half an inch, and if you need to, you can just trim that off, and it's really a safe way of doing it. A little bit of this footage that I'm showing is just boring cutting footage, so I'm going to talk a bit about how to cut, because there's kind of a grace to it. You want to keep the blade as perpendicular to the leather as possible, straight up and down, and also really make sure that the blade is guided along your straight edge. And you also don't have to cut through in one pass. You can go light and then go over it as many times as you need. For example, when I go around curves, I totally go light at first. And another key aspect to cutting is to have a sharp blade. So you want to either strop your blade before you use this or just change out your blades. I'm using a basic utility knife, and the blades are pretty cheap for that, but I don't like to waste, so I try to sharpen as much as possible. Another key aspect is to have proper lighting, because if you have shadows casting over your work, or if you can barely see it, then of course your work isn't going to be as good as it can be. And now most of that boring cutting is done, so I'm dry fitting the flap. As you can see, the flap goes over the front of the sheath, and you don't want that. Like, you can have it cover the front of the stitching line, but that's not really the most aesthetically pleasing way to do it. And I'm cutting the back of the flap. As you can see, I'm using another piece of leather to support my straight edge. That's a pretty cool technique that I learned a while back, and it does help when you're in those tricky, weird situations. Now I'm folding my flap over, and I actually didn't add enough trim allowance. I should have added half an inch, and I probably added like a quarter of an inch maybe. So thankfully I made my flap wide enough so I had a little bit of a fallback in case that happened. But if you're making a strap sheath, then you can't really make mistakes like that. So of course, with time and practice and all those things you hear all the time, it will get better. And I just finished trimming my flap so it lines up perfectly. And now it is time to oil and dye the leather. If you buy pre-dyed leather, then you are probably a smart person. I've been dyeing leather by hand for a while now, and it just takes so much time. But from here on out, I will buy pre-dyed leather. One nice thing about dyeing by yourself is you have so many colors to choose from, and you aren't limited to buying a certain color for an entire huge piece of leather. But anyways, the way I dye leather is I first oil it with neat's foot oil. That helps it stay consistent, and then I use a sponge to spread the dye evenly, and I do multiple coats until I feel like it looks great. And that's the end of today's video. If you guys liked it, feel free to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me, and stay tuned for the second part of this series.